Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Kevin Mitchell, who is Professor of Genetics and Neuroscience at Trinity College in Dublin. Kevin is the author of the recent book, Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. It's a great read. I've always been fascinated by the question of whether free will exists, or whether we are under an illusion that we have agency when in fact we are essentially deterministic algorithms who are reacting to our environment. So I read Kevin's book with great interest, and I must say I'm swayed. Kevin, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really, really a pleasure.
So, Kevin, I really enjoyed reading your book, Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. Fascinating subject, but it's been around us for thousands of years. Before we get into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a geneticist and neuroscientist. My background really has been mainly in working on the genetics of brain wiring. So starting just from really the developmental question, how does the brain of an organism self-assemble during development, and how are the instructions for that in some way encoded in the genome? And from there I moved into a number of different areas. I got more interested in not just the genetics of neural development, but the genetics of neurodevelopmental disorders. So conditions like schizophrenia and epilepsy and autism and so on, which obviously relate to this question of this genetic program that in some way directs how the brain develops, with the idea that sometimes that can go in different directions that can manifest in ways that we see as, either as clinical symptoms or indeed just as the variation that we see across people in personality and cognition and all sorts of traits that we, observe in people's psychology and behavior. Yeah, so that got me interested in thinking about some pretty broad connections, really, between neuroscience and psychology and psychiatry and perception and so on, which is where, eventually I got up the courage to think about trying to pull some of this stuff together from these different fields, because one of my experiences in sort of moving between fields is that they tend to be very isolated. So people in one field tend to know what they know in lots of detail, which is great. We're all very specialized. But they often don't, they're often not that aware of fields that, I would think are pretty adjacent, actually. And so partly I've gotten interested in trying to think of frameworks that can allow us to span those different kinds of levels.
There's a lot of stuff there. Lots of really interesting questions at the intersections of these fields, aren't there?
And even like within neuroscience, for example, there's people who call themselves neuroscientists who are doing completely different things and just investigating neural systems at completely different levels, down to the level of molecules and cells and all the way up to entire brains and behavior and minds and cognition and so on. And even there, it's not really clear. It feels like what we lack is a framework that connects those levels, that lets us explain how they relate to each other without reducing what's happening at high levels to say that it's just a bunch of molecular stuff or it's just a bunch of electrical firings. We want to keep what's happening up here, but understand how it's implemented in all the detailed stuff down here. And that's a challenge, even within a field that identifies itself with a single name like neuroscience.
Yeah. I mean, and by up here, you're talking about things like psychology, where we have goals, desires, and intentions. And down here, you're talking about neuroscience, which is this sort of jiggly mass of, wetware with potentials and currents and stuff like that, right? It's just fascinating how, how the two are connected. And it's an area which I guess is, has been advancing recently because of, better methods of observation. And, I've sort of gotten into sort of neuroscience fairly deeply myself recently because I've, gotten interested in smell, but that's a, entirely different subject, but I find that fascinating as well. But let's come back to, the subject for today, which is free will. So what prompted you to write about free will, right? Something as big as this, right? I mean, that's a nice, big, juicy question.
It's absurd to think of launching into something like this. It was two things, really. One of them was that I wrote a book in 2018 called Innate, which is about how the wiring of our brains shapes who we are. And the premise there, the argument was that that we're not born as blank slates, that we really do have, first of all, human nature, which is different from other species, but we all have a variation on that. If there's some kind of genetic program that specifies the wiring of a human brain generally, well, we all have variations on that genetic program. And we have variations in how the program actually plays out. So development itself adds some variability to the outcome. And so we really do have predispositions in the way our brains are wired, and those manifest in our behavioral tendencies. So the things that we call personality traits really are just tendencies to behave in certain ways given certain scenarios. And, they reflect things that we can think about even in animals, like, how risk averse is a person or an animal? How sensitive to threats? How rewarding do they find rewards? How long are they willing to wait, to delay gratification for some reward and so on? There's lots of kind of parameters that we can think of there. But the upshot is that our decision making is informed by, in some way, these underlying parameters of the circuits that do that job. And I would often get questions after talks on that, which would be along the lines of, okay, well, look, you're saying my brain is wired a certain way by all these things that I had no hand in choosing. So if those are going to affect my decision making, well, how free am I? Do I really have free will? Or am I just executing my pre-programming, basically? So that was one impulse. It kind of came from, behavioral genetics and development. And then there's a much more general impulse, which just comes from the field of neuroscience these days. So as you mentioned, we're making tremendous progress in figuring out circuits and systems that underlie various behaviors. But even the way I just phrased that is a very reductive way of talking about it, right? So I'm saying these circuits and systems underlie a behavior. That makes it sound like the reason that an animal does something or a human does something is because these neural circuits fired, or because this system was active or that system was active. So it places the causal emphasis and power on isolated elements within a person. Right? It says, rather than saying it's you made a decision, it's bits of your brain made the decision for you. You were being pushed around by your parts. And I think I don't know how widespread the tendency is, but there's certainly a tendency among some neuroscientists to make the claim that neuroscience is showing that free will is an illusion, right? That we're revealing these mechanisms. We can causally intervene in them in animals and even sometimes in humans. We can make organisms do this or that. We can make them think this or that. So basically, that's all there is. There it is. It's just the neural circuitry, and cognition is just kind of an epiphenomenon. And that didn't quite sit right with me. And I wanted to try and figure out a way where we could still think about cognition as a real thing while realizing, yes, it has to be implemented in some kind of neural instantiation.
I realized that I should have actually started with something just much more basic, which is like, what is free will? Because, which might get us into like, what is life, which is what you get into your book. But I have to say, when I read the first part of your book, which is describing why people make the case for determinism, right? I was convinced that, this makes so much sense. At the end of the day, biology is chemistry and chemistry is physics. And, I was like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, right? So reading the first part of your book, I was like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Like, what's he got to say? And then I read the rest of your book and I know your thesis. But let's go back to what is free will?
Sure. And you know what? It's funny when you say you start with a more basic question. Of course, it's not a more simple question, right? To answer,
no, it's not. It's not.
So I actually try to avoid starting with a hard and fast definition, because I think if we had a definition that everyone agreed on, we wouldn't have been having this debate for 2,500 years or more. And so there's one definition that I really think is problematic, and that is to say you only have free will if your behavior is completely free, absolutely free of any prior causes whatsoever. So if anything at all is influencing your behavior, then you're not free and you don't have free will. And I think if you just define it, if you inflate free will to that level, that absolutist level, and then you say, well, that can't be met because it's an absurd bar, and then you absolutely deny any free will, it just seems like you're going to two extremes. You're setting this thing up that couldn't exist. Because it makes no sense, right?
It's almost by definition, right? It's almost by definition that it couldn't exist. If you make it devoid of everything, then you're acting randomly, right?
Exactly. And what it means is that a self, an organism, wouldn't exist, right? It's not just that it wouldn't have freedom. It's that if it's not acting in a way that's informed by its past experience and that's directed towards a future state and its adaptive behavior, then first of all, it wouldn't be alive. It would never have evolved. But also it wouldn't be a self, because it would have no continuity of reasons or memories or any experience or history through time. And so, that to me is just incoherent. And then there's another kind of way of thinking about it, which is sort of a dualist version. So the idea that we've got physical stuff, and then for you to be in charge, what that means is that your mental self must be in charge. And that kind of brings up this image of a little homunculus sitting inside your brain who's in charge of things, but who's not part of the biological goings on somehow, right? And that doesn't make sense either. That's a sort of the ghost in the machine idea. And if that's the only thing that will satisfy you, that's the only thing that counts as free will, then that can't be achieved either. So what I wanted to do was come to a more naturalized view, which is somewhere in between, really, in that there's, your decision making is mediated by some physical stuff, but it can't be reduced to that level, right? You're still holistically engaged in making decisions. And so I like to start with just the phenomenology and say, what is it that we're talking about when we talk about free will? And that would be, for me, the feeling that we have that we are in charge of things, right? That we make decisions, that we select our own actions, that we can control our own behavior, both in a momentary way and in a sustained way through time. So that for me feels like the really basic phenomenology of our existence, right? We go around all the time thinking, what should I do? Controlling our actions, thinking what other people are doing, and so on. And when some people, look to physics and say, well, that couldn't possibly be true. Physics says the world is deterministic, and they just deny that phenomenology. I want to sort of say, well, hang on a second there. You're making a really bold claim. Let's look at the evidence for that.
Coming at this from the standpoint of a physicist, right, looking at things as a physical system, that's a pretty compelling argument, right? That the physics of the system is known. And so given the current state of things, the future state is known as well, right? Since you know the physics of things. So from the current state, you can actually predict the future state. And as you say, we can do this with phenomenal precision, right? To the point of predicting, eclipses and all that kind of stuff, right? So this would embolden physicists to say, look, what are you talking about, right? We can predict things hundreds of years into the future, right? These are incredibly precise theories. Where's the room for anything else?
Yeah. And that's a perfectly valid argument if you accept that physics really is deterministic. And of course, if you look at the kind of canonical examples like the orbits of planets and eclipses and when a comet is going to show up again and so on, those are very deterministic systems because they're very simple systems, right? I mean, they have very few variables, very few parameters, very few components, and with very simple kinds of behaviors that can be predicted. The fact that that kind of a system can be predicted with accuracy does not mean that every kind of physical system can be predicted in that way. So if there's some fundamental indeterminacy or indefiniteness in the parameters of a physical system, that just may not make much of a difference for the orbits of planets, right? Because they're not sensitive to initial conditions. But in many other kinds of more complex systems, the future is basically more open in the sense that if, for example, you're trying to predict the weather, the small decimal points way down the line in the values that you input into your prediction can make the thing veer off in widely different ways. And one of the ways of thinking about the indefiniteness of the universe is like that. It's to say, actually, the way far down decimal points of a lot of physical parameters of things are not fixed. It's not just that we don't know them. The universe doesn't know them. There's a kind of a just-in-time reality where they become fixed through interaction in the period that we experience as the present. But in the future, they're just genuinely indefinite. And that is, to me, and this is all very open to interpretation and argument. But to me, that's a really appealing kind of scenario where, and it's been advanced by people like Lee Smolin and Nicolas Gizan and others, where, first of all, it gives a kind of explanation for why time feels the way it does, why things in the past are fixed and things in the future are open. But it also, I think, gives a handle on thinking about indeterminacy that doesn't have the arbitrariness that we often hear about when people will say, okay, well, look at the quantum level, things are a bit indeterminate, sure. But once we get to the classical level, the size of objects like you and me, all of that noisiness cancels out. It just averages out, and classical physics is deterministic. And that's always seemed like a bit of a fudge to me. Like, how could that happen just with scale? And
by the way, I still haven't got my head around that. I studied thermodynamics in college, and I was a chemical engineer, and so I went deep into this, and it still feels like sleight of hand to me.
There is some sleight of hand, and I'm not saying I understand it either. In fact, I do advance in the book this kind of idea about indefiniteness in time, which makes some sense to me. But the general point that I wanted to get across was that physics, in fact, our best interpretations of physics do not say that the next state of the system is fully fixed by the current state and the low-level laws of physics. Right? There's inherently probabilistic processes that are happening there, and the argument there is, well, in a sense, this flips the script of the debate on free will. So ordinarily, people will say, okay, everyone accepts determinism is true. Now, what do we do about free will? And they're left saying either, well, free will couldn't exist because choices don't exist and possibilities don't exist. There's only one future that could ever happen. Or they take the compatibilist view and say, okay, choices don't really exist, but individual organisms are really complicated and they're unpredictable, and we can treat them as if they have moral responsibility, even though they're not really making choices. And that just feels like a fudge to me. However, if you flip the script and say, well, look, why accept determinism as your starting premise there?
So, Kevin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to sort of elaborate on that for the listeners, right? Yeah. So I think what you're saying is that this creates a conundrum for moral philosophers, right? Because if everything is preordained, then, hey, I had no choice over it, right? We have no choices, everything is written. And so, where does morality come in, right? And so this has posed a real problem for moral philosophers. And as you point out, people like Dan Dennett said, no, there's something in between, right? That you still need to act morally because it matters. But again, that doesn't somehow it leaves me kind of wanting, right? To, on the one hand, to say, yeah, there's determinism, but morality also matters.
I know. I
You
never
know,
have been able to. I never have been able to get it. I've tried and tried to understand that
yeah.
compatibilist argument. I mean, in fairness, I think I do understand it. I just disagree with it. It just doesn't really make sense.
So Kevin, like I said, when I started reading your book, the first few chapters, I was like, yep, determinism. Okay, he's really going to have to sway me. And then as I read on, here's the question I asked myself, right? And you say this in the book, I think several times, right? So is what's different that life changes things, right? As opposed to physical systems, right? So I'm willing to believe, that physical systems are deterministic, the laws of physics apply, all of that stuff, right? But I think you make the case that when life emerged, things changed, right? And you point out that initially, like, what is the purpose of life? Well, the purpose of life is just to persist, right? To exist and to persist, and I think if I understand this correctly, you make the case that with increasing complexity comes desire, purpose, agency. And so we then begin to sort of act on the physical world. And there it's less clear whether, we're being governed by laws of physics, that are completely deterministic or something else. Am I expressing this correctly?
Yes, you are. Absolutely. And so the key thing here is to realize that actually some of the challenge of determinism is actually a challenge of reductionism. It's actually the point of some of the argument of determinism is to say, look, all of the causes are down at the lowest levels and they just bubble up. Everything comes from the bottom up. And so the question is, how do we get away from that? How can you have macroscopic organizational causation? And that for me is the real key thing. And so if you think about determinism, I think you're lost, because if everything's determined at the lowest levels, there's no room for any other causes. And in fact, I don't think you would even get any complex macroscopic organizations emerging, because generally most of the macroscopic systems that we see have been selected for some function. And we see that in our designed artifacts, but that's true of living things as well. So if you flip the script, though, if you say, well, look, let's not accept that determinism is the right premise to start with, because physics doesn't seem to say that. So let's say, okay, well, indeterminism is, well, how does that help? And it helps, first of all, because you're not asking where does the freedom come from, right? The freedom comes for free. The universe is just, like I said, radically open. Lots of things could happen. But then the challenge is for an organism, how does it, as an entity, right, as a causal whole, control what happens? How does it make happen what it wants to happen? And there, so the challenge is all these futures are possible, and the organism just wants one of them to happen, right? So there, I think the challenge of this indeterminacy also provides the opportunity, in the sense that if just the low-level details of a physical system underdetermine how it's going to evolve, then that gives some scope for the way that it's organized to have some causal power, right? And this requires thinking of causation in a slightly broader way than most people normally do, because most people think of causes, and as scientists we're trained like this, in terms of physical forces pushing things around, right? All causes eventually cash out as physical forces, right? But actually constraints, the way a system is organized, can have just as much causal influence over what happens if the physical forces are not the complete story. In fact, the constraints set up what the physical forces are, right? You don't get any physical forces if you don't have some kind of organization or inhomogeneities of physical stuff. So,
walk us through walk us through an example, because one of the questions I had for you was, okay, so you've got a theory. What's the evidence for your theory? Because you're a neuroscientist, a geneticist, and you're sort of bringing new data to the table, right? Because you start with philosophers 2,300 years ago, Democritus and Epicurus. I love those names, by the way. Was Epicurus the foodie?
Yes, he was. Yeah, he was the
right.
the Epicurean, quite a hedonist, actually. Yeah,
so
all about
so
the pleasure principle.
Yeah. Right. So so these debates go way back, right? And philosophers have been debating stuff sort of abstractly, but you're bringing sort of data to the table, right? So what's the evidence for your theory? And walk us through an example of this sort of, where there's intention and desire and planning and causation at the macro level, and how it sort of occurs at the micro level.
Yeah. The question is, how could the organization of a system be configured in such a way as to be able to enact goal-directed behavior? Right? I think that's okay. Good. So basically, my premise in the book is that actually all life does that. That's exactly what life is an organized physical system that has some kind of pattern of processes that are constraining each other in such a way as to keep the whole system going, right? That's what being a living system is. There isn't anything else to being alive except to keeping all that activity going in the same kind of way.
And having a lot of order, as you point out, right? Because
Absolutely.
Life is crucially about order, right? And this is where the second law comes in.
And the thermodynamic, so Schrodinger, famously sort of recognized that you can think of life in physical terms as basically just a highly unlikely pattern of matter. And it's a very dynamic pattern, right? But that's a pattern that keeps itself going by doing thermodynamic work. It has to take in free energy to keep itself organized in that way. And it's causally insulated from the rest of the universe, right? It keeps itself out of equilibrium with the environment. It's not sensitive to every passing cause physically or chemically outside it because it has a membrane or a cell wall or a skin if it's a multicellular organism. So, in order to keep itself going in a dynamic world, right? If the world was always the same, you could set up a system like this and it would just take in energy and run forever, right? There wouldn't be any real life to it, right? Well, the life comes in because the world is changing, right? The world is highly dynamic. And so the system has to be able to react and adapt to things in the world. So it is chugging along happily. Something changes in the world and it's now not happy, right? It's in a state that it doesn't want to be in. It's being moved away from the pattern that constitutes its own self. And so it has to take some kind of action to bring itself back into its proper operating regime. And, in simple organisms, for example, like bacteria, one thing they might do if a food source runs out is that they might switch their metabolic pathways to a different food source. So that's a good thing to be able to do, but it's acting as a sort of an internal reconfiguration that's not yet acting on the world. But another thing it might do is move, right? So if it runs out of food in one place, well, a good strategy is to move somewhere else. And if it's going to do that, then an even better strategy is to have some information about what's out in the world and make a good choice about where to move. So it's not just moving randomly, it's moving towards a food source. So even in that simple scenario, you get a system where its organizational configuration is such that it has some functionalities to it at the macroscopic level, where it can sense things in the environment, it can move towards things that turn out to be adaptive to approach, and it can move away from things that are adaptive to avoid. And those functionalities are configured by the action of natural selection. Right? Bacteria that tend to move towards food survive. That configuration persists and they reproduce more and so on. So that's a really, really basic kind of level where you can say, okay, here's this single-celled organism. It has a challenge ecologically to solve, which is to survive in a changeable world. And the way that it does that is to basically do this kind of very basic kind of cognition, where it's sensing things in the world, it's integrating multiple signals at once relative to its own internal state, relative to lots of context about what else is out in the world, relative to its very immediate history. And then it is collectively, in a holistic way, making a decision about what to do. And it's not thinking about it, right? It's just enacted in these control policies within it. But does that capture what I was talking about? That the organization of the system can do functional work in determining what happens in itself and in the world.
That makes total sense. So let's talk about some of the evidence that you put forward in support of the theory, right? Because this is all interesting data. You talk about the widely misinterpreted data set by
Benjamin Libet.
Yeah, exactly. Right. All that stuff. So just summarize the evidence out there that is in support of your theory.
Yeah, in a sense, you can look at a lot of the evidence in different ways. So it's more, I guess, an interpretive framework as opposed to any particular piece of evidence that proves it or would disprove it. In my view, it's a way of looking at it and thinking about it. So even, for example, let's just stick with the simple bacteria, right? And you can, in the lab, you can control this system in such a way that you expose the bacterium to one sort of food source over here, and that activates a receptor molecule. It sends a little wiggle into the cell. First of all, let me say that's an informational system, right? It's not a physical transfer of energy or matter. It's just a conformational change that says there's something out in the world, right, that you should care about. But then it looks like a pretty linear pathway that goes from the sensor to control the motor of how it's moving. And that, for me, is kind of an illusory perspective because it's highly isolated and reduced and controlled. And in fact, in the world, bacteria don't encounter just one thing at a time. They've got all kinds of things going on. As I just kind of said, it's a much more holistic, integrated system where I would say it's not being pushed around by its own parts. It's the whole system holistically configured to produce the most adaptive response under complicated, dynamically changing conditions. And I would say the same thing is true for us. So one of the concerns that I mentioned at the start that neuroscience seems to provoke in people is this idea that when I can say, okay, look, here's this circuit that's active when someone's making a decision, and I can go into an animal and I can activate that circuit and I can make the animal do X, Y, or Z. Well, then that's all there is, right? That the animal is being pushed around by the activation of that circuit. And if that's all you're doing, right, if you have this tightly controlled scenario and you're driving some circuit like crazy using some sort of technique, then yes, you can get an animal to do something in particular, right? But again, that's just not how living organisms encounter the world. The world just doesn't present itself in binary choices one at a time. It's got all kinds of stuff happening. The organism has to integrate lots of information. It has to adjudicate over many different possible actions and goals in the context of its own internal states, possibly conflicting goals, short and long term, all sorts of behavior that it is managing and sustaining through time in a collective way for its own reasons. And again, if you look at it that way, so it's more of a perspective shift to say, look, if you approach these things as in a really tightly controlled way, they look like mechanisms, but that's an illusion. And I guess the upshot is really that that organisms do things for reasons, and they're the reasons of the organism, not the reasons of its parts. So your neurons don't have reasons to do something, right? The proteins in a bacterium don't have reasons to do something, but the organism does. And natural selection ensures that the configuration of the system is such that it's the needs of the organism that are met by the functionalities of the system.
Right. One of the things I sort of pondered when I was reading your book was whether free will is sort of this binary thing, whether you have it or you don't have it. And it got me thinking about, do animals have free will in general? I sort of extrapolated your thinking to that your position would be, yeah, animals can have free will. And so, I'm willing to believe that, the lion that's sitting there says, yeah, let me just go, cool myself off. But I could just as well, I do it in a number of ways. But for now, I'm just going to decide to sit under the tree as opposed to go into the, into the pond, because these are sort of 50-50 kinds of outcomes. And one of the arguments you make is that we may actually have sort of randomness be sort of part of us, that we actually deliberately, sometimes just make choices, when the stakes aren't high, when things are similar, we kind of do a coin flip and say, well, I'll do this one, right? Because because the other point isn't particularly compelling. So does that sound reasonable, that, that different living organisms would have different degrees of free will depending on the complexity of their cognitive system?
Yes, with the exception that I do sort of reserve the term free will itself for humans, but that's only partly because it's so philosophically loaded and it comes with so much baggage. So if we use the more neutral term agency or even behavioral control, then we're in a territory where we can just have much more empirically based discussions that aren't so, they're not anthropomorphic, they're not tied up with consciousness and things like that we don't understand very well in other organisms. So yes, I would say even a simple bacterium has a kind of very, very basic kind of agency. It's not thinking about anything, right? But it's enacting these agential capacities in order to accommodate to incoming information and keep itself alive. And of course, as you get more sophisticated, you get the multicellular animals that have nervous systems, the nervous systems increase in complexity and so on. You get greater and greater levels of control, greater cognitive depth. So these are animals that can think about more types of things. They can think about more complicated relations between things. They can develop a kind of understanding of the world. They can especially learn from experience and store knowledge. And then they can use that to make predictions about the world that go further into the future. And so that means that they can plan, they can guide their own behavior, they can sustain agendas through time in a way that goes way, way beyond just this sort of reactive stimulus response mechanism where you're making binary choices in response to environments that you just encounter. That's not how we live. It's not how most organisms live. We guide ourselves. We create our environments by choosing them, right? We shape the future. That's the future we're going to find ourselves in. And we do that in such a way as to carry out our plans and achieve our goals, some of which may be far in the future. So I think that we have both degrees of agency across different kinds of species, different animals. And I also think that we have degrees of agency. Well, first of all, let me say, I think we have kinds of agency potentially in different kinds of species. So, I look at the lineage that goes to humans in this book. I don't explore, for example, the lineage that goes to insects or birds or octopuses or things that also have complex cognition. And they may have quite different kinds of agential control. I think that's possible. But then in humans, within a species, I think there's also variation in how much behavioral control, how much cognitive control over our behavior we have at any moment. And there's differences that just vary as traits between people in terms of impulse control and how much we're willing to delay gratification, how much we're willing to work towards a long distance goal, how conscientious we are, all of those things that we call executive function. Those are traits that vary between people. They really vary over our lifespan, right? I mean, from babies and children have terrible impulse control, right? And juveniles do. That's why we don't put them in prison when they commit crimes, is because we know they're not as responsible because they literally don't have the systems matured and developed well enough to have this cognitive level of rational control that we expect of adults. And then, of course, there's all kinds of psychiatric conditions that can impair that self-control. And there's all kinds of drugs and other sorts of scenarios, externally imposed scenarios, under which our capacity for rational control can be diminished as well.
If you look at the neuroscience community, right? Like, what's your sense of what proportion of people do you think in that community would subscribe to sort of, free will versus determinism, if you were to take a guess?
Yeah, it's really hard to say because there's a few vocal people who are, very strong free will skeptics. Robert Sapolsky, for example, has a new book just coming out called Determined, which is all about life without free will. And it's funny, we look at a lot of the same data base, basically, and come to different conclusions from it. And then there's people like Sam Harris, who has also advanced the same idea based on neuroscience data, and many others. But I don't know if that's just a vocal minority. My guess is that most neuroscientists don't think about it too much, or aren't committed to one view or another. They probably, I would say, feel like we do have free will, but might not see how that could be true. But they aren't willing necessarily to just say it couldn't be true. So hopefully the framework that I lay out kind of will offer a sketch, at least, of a solution to that, to say, yes, here's how we can have real conscious rational control over what we do for our own reasons. With, deliberation is a real thing. Cognition is a real thing. It's not an epiphenomenon. It is based in neural mechanisms, but it's not just neural mechanisms. And hopefully that can, reconcile the high-level psychological view with the lower-level neuroscience nuts and bolts.
Yeah, the implications of determinism are pretty weird and scary, aren't they?
They are.
Right?
And it's very odd to me to think what, really strong free will skeptics are after when they're trying to convince people that they should also not believe in free will. First of all, I find that a bit paradoxical in the sense that making the effort to convince someone sort of assumes that someone could change their mind, and that what's on their mind could change their behavior. So it assumes mental causation is a real thing, in one sense. So there's a slight irony there to that. But one of the places where this is important is, as we talked about, in moral responsibility and legal responsibility. And I think one of the motivating factors for some people who argue against free will is their concerns about what philosophers call moral luck. So the idea that some people are just born with, their genetic makeup, the way their brain developed, the circumstances that they're born into, the societal or family environments that they grow up in, that basically makes them, say, commit crimes. And one way to think about that is that that behavior is completely determined by all these prior causes, and it leaves no room for the agent to do anything. And I think a more nuanced way to think about it is to admit, there's loads of influences on our behavior. Of course there are. That doesn't have to be taken to this absolute extreme to say the agent then is not doing anything. I don't think that makes sense. But I will say I am very sympathetic to the concern that our legal system should take into account people's circumstances, and the fact that, someone who really is constitutionally short-tempered and physically aggressive may literally not be able to control themselves. And then there's a question of, okay, well, how should we judge that person for that and for their behavior, and how should we deal with them in the legal system? But I think you can do that without relying on the metaphysical claim that free will just doesn't exist at all. I think we can have nuanced discussions around that. And in fact, I think the legal system and legal scholars and jurists and philosophers over the centuries have thought about those things a lot. So it seems odd to me for neuroscientists to come charging into the fray saying, no, it was just their brains made them do it. You must change the whole legal system.
You're talking about the legal system. When I was reading your book, I was trying to make connections to some of the things I talked about with Danny Kahneman, who was on the show a couple of years ago, and we were talking about noise, which is the book that he'd just written then, which I really enjoyed, and I'd written a review for it. He talks about different kinds of noise. One particular kind of noise, where he talks about occasion noise, I think is what he calls it, which is that the same decision maker presented the same stimulus makes a different decision, right? So he gives this example of a crime where the average sentence is 7 years. More than half the time, judges disagree by at least 4 years, right? Which is sort of scary, right? So this is on the sentencing side. And But I got to thinking about this occasion noise where, let's say, a judge may be harsh if his football team loses on Sunday versus being sort of generous if his football team wins, right? So he gives that as an example of occasion noise. And I was wondering whether that fits into this notion of, determinism versus agency. I'm going on for too long here, but one of the things I questioned is, or thought about is whether people would say, well, it's not exactly the same thing, right? That Kahneman is talking about, because these are slightly different situations and it's impossible to really control to that degree, where it's like absolutely identical. It's sort of, you talk about the absurdity of sort of rolling back the tape, in your book, right? That's sort of, if you could roll back the tape, would you always make the same decision? Like, would the action always be the same? Yeah, and by the way, I wasn't quite sure about the answer to that question, right? Because I think you implied that, yeah, you would, right, if it were exactly identical, but that's almost like besides the point.
Kind of, yeah. So there's a couple ways to look at that. One is that there may be some scenarios in which we absolutely know what we want to do and we're going to do it. And if we had the chance to do it again, we absolutely would do it again because we had good reasons to do it. And it may be something that we deliberate on and we know that we want to do it, or it may be even habitual, that we would always do it because we put in the effort, from prior experience to learn this is a good thing to do. When the situation is A, I should do X. And in that thought experiment, if we rolled back the tape, as it were, and had the physical state of the universe at some particular instant and did it again, the person would do it again because they had good reasons to do it. And that's fine. There are other times when we don't have a good reason to do it, right? When we don't care, or we don't have enough information, but there's just not, it's an ambiguous scenario, or it's not particularly relevant what the outcome is. We choose a tuna sandwich or a chicken sandwich. Who cares? Maybe 50-50, as you said earlier. And under those circumstances, we actually may use some randomness in the system as a resource, as a deadlock breaker. It's not that important what we do. That choice is not that important. What's important is that we choose something, right? And we do it quickly. And that's the thing. Organisms have to make these decisions with incomplete information in uncertain environments over multiple conflicting goals with infinite time, very pressing time sometimes. So they don't have the luxury of allowing the computations, if you think about it in that way, to reach a conclusion, right? They just have to hurry up. So there's going to be some rounding errors in the processes that actually happen, right? For the purpose, just because they do it in a hurry, but also because they have noisy components. Now, most of the time, the noise is buffered so that we can do what we need to do, right? So that the system works as it should. But sometimes we can just draw on that noise to break a deadlock so that we can do something and get on with our lives, right? So in that way, I think if you turn back the clock thought experiment is like, there is no one answer to it. It depends on the scenario. But the other point, which I think is a really deeper one, is I want to ask to when. When people say, I'm going to turn back the clock to this instant, I'm like, wait a minute, what is this instant that you're talking about? As if there's an instant of zero duration during which the state of a system is infinitely knowable and defined. And physics just says that isn't true. First of all, the idea of a time slice of zero duration doesn't really make any sense, right? Time just is duration. So if you have a window of duration, well, then the system is changing as that duration is going on. So just in terms of the physics of it, the thought experiment doesn't make much sense because you can't have a very completely defined system in an instant of time. But the other thing is that, again, that's asking, where does the freedom come from? And what I think we should be asking is, where does the choice and the control come from? Where the freedom just is there. The control is the interesting thing. So under some circumstances, we'll do what we want. Under other circumstances, we'll do something at random, but we may decide to do something at random.
I was struck by that the concept of time plays a big role here, right? I mean, for you, the future is a distribution of possibilities. The present is a choice or an instantiation of one of those possible sets of possibilities. And then the past is just, it happened, like it happened and it's immutable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it sort of reminded me of my grandfather who would keep chanting, in Sanskrit, Kaloham, which is, God is time. And I always wondered what he meant, but as I got older, I sort of began to ponder the possible things that he could have meant. And your notion of this sort of, that the present, that the time is sort of instantiation of multiple possibilities was kind of interesting. And I like the way you tied it into, Heisenberg and Schrodinger and all of that. I'm still trying to get my head around that, but I've encouraged people to.
So am I. And like I said earlier, it's one sort of interpretation that, to me, makes sense and has some coherence to it, I hope. Doesn't mean it's the right one necessarily. Of course, these are huge questions in the foundations of physics and metaphysics that aren't well resolved, but it's at least a scenario in which the future is open and organisms can control what happens. And I think that's really important. And you're right that time plays an important part in the whole thesis, actually. And really, it's kind of a perspective shift from an object-based ontology of the world, a substance-based ontology, to a more process-based philosophy, where the whole point of thinking about life is as a process that has continuity through time. It's a historical process. And I don't just mean evolutionarily. I mean, the life of any individual organism is a historical process that it doesn't mean anything for it to be alive except to be extended through time. It doesn't mean anything to be a self except to have some continuity through time. And that's continuity of the constraints that keep it all itself, as opposed to just letting it dissipate into the universe. And to me, there's something really powerful about that. And it brings back some of the philosophies of people like Whitehead and Bergson that were popular in the early 20th century, but then kind of faded away. But I see them coming back, and partly because we also seem to be moving from very reductive mechanistic views of things to much more dynamical systems views of the nervous system, of living organisms generally, for example. So those methodological approaches and the computational approaches of what's happening fit much better with a process philosophy where time is a key element in not just understanding the system, but what the system is about. And if you take the time element out of it, you don't see it as process. You're just missing the point of what life is, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is that combination of time and complexity, where agency kind of makes sense, right? That there's all of this stuff going on. There are interactions happening, and then the present happens. Like you make a choice and, rinse and repeat. I want to segue into sort of the future. This podcast is called Brave New World after all, right? And, one of the things I sort of think about is, and this is sort of more, talking about agency, right? We now have, acquired sufficient knowledge to actually edit life, right? We've got CRISPR and, all of this sort of amazing stuff going on. Does this bolster your theory, that actually, look, here we are, that this is unprecedented, right? We've never had the ability before this to really edit life, on a mass scale, right? It brings into question what life will even mean, going forward.
I didn't think about this before, and I probably should have included something in the book about it. But so I do have this little epilogue about artificial intelligence and artificial life, which maybe we can get to in a minute. But what I didn't really consider, which I think is really interesting, is synthetic biology. So we have, first of all, the ability to edit, living things, as you said. So we can change genes. We can effectively alter the configuration of these control circuits and these big networks, gene regulatory networks that both embody the living organism in terms of this network of constraints, a regime of interlocking constraints, but that also give it the functionalities that it has, the particular functionalities of any organism and its bits. And so we can get at the logic of that. And if anything, this is a sort of a testing ground where, you were asking earlier about the sort of experimental evidence. This is a particular way you could approach the problem of agency. I'm making some claims that in order to be an agent, evolution has configured things with certain components and systems that work like this. And that's my claim that constitutes agency. Well, one way to test that, of course, is to change or manipulate those systems and see if an organism still behaves in an adaptive way. And, we've been doing that for decades. So that's what a lot of, behavioral developmental biology and so on is about. It's what a lot of neuroscience is about. But a kind of a more exciting possibility is the idea of building this from the ground up. So really building an organism from scratch, as it were. And I think the person who's probably done that the most, or made the most strides towards that, is Craig Venter, who has, created a kind of a minimal bacterial genome by looking across many, many different types of bacteria and seeing what you can get rid of, and then actually creating that chemically and putting it into a bacterium. So it's not de novo, right? It's using lots of biological information, but it's a way to think, okay, do we really understand it? The payoff is, can we build it? So if you can build it and it does what you think it should do, then I think it means that the theory is pretty good, right? And so that's an interesting testing ground in synthetic biology for whether it is indeed the case that these kinds of configurations give organisms the causal power to act autonomously in the world in such a way that they project themselves into the future, right? That's really what they're doing, right? Is they're keeping themselves going. They're making future self happen by what they're doing in the world, right? And they're making stuff in the world happen as well. So if we can build systems that can do that, either with synthetic biology or with artificial systems in silico or in robots or whatever, then I think we have a useful testing ground for the theory as a whole.
So in that case, could we get to the point where artificial machines have free will?
I think we could get to the point where they have agency in a way that I can define, right? So free will, right, is very hard to define. Agency, you can quantify in interesting ways. You can quantify how causally insulated a system is from what's going on outside it. You can quantify this projection into the future, right? So how much information does my state now have that is predictive of my state in the future? I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it that's been developed by people like David Krakauer and Jessica Flack and colleagues. That's a way that you can operationalize it and formalize the test, where free will is a bit more nebulous. But yeah, I think, look, there's nothing. Part of my claim is that there's no magic required. Right? Organisms can be in charge of their own behavior without there having to be some immaterial soul or spirit involved. Right? And so if that's the case, and if we can understand the configuration that gives them that causal power, then I don't see any reason in principle why we shouldn't be able to simulate that or recreate it in some other kind of format. Unless, there's something really specific about the biological machinery, and maybe there is. I don't see any reason in principle why there should be. But yeah, if we could instantiate something with the right kind of configuration and the right kind of relationship to the environment, right, where it has the opportunity to causally intervene on the world, to learn the outcomes of its actions, to incorporate that into its own knowledge store by reconfiguring its own internal circuits, which is exactly what we do, and then to deploy that causal knowledge as causal power potential in the world. If we can build systems like that, then I don't see any reason why we couldn't have something that we would call an artificial agent.
Fascinating. And one thing that we haven't actually talked about that I want to get to is, and you talk about this in your book, which is meaning and understanding, right? Because one of the points you make is that meaning about the world is actually embedded in our machinery. One of the things I learned, by the way, reading your book is you talk about, I've never really thought about what information actually, the roots of the word information, which comes from inform, which means it has some physical form, right? And so because I never thought of information as having a physical form, but I sort of thought about it and I said, okay, I get it, right? That everything physical out there is information, right? It's in form, and even digital information is in form. The form is bits. It has to be physical at some level. That
it has to be
information
instantiated. Yeah,
instantiated. Yeah, because we tend to think of information as something sort of abstract, but it's actually physical, right? At some level. Want to tie this back to is debate these days as to whether ChatGPT really understands anything or whether it's just a stochastic parrot, right? So there's two sides on this position, whether it understands anything or not. And I guess my sort of broader question is, how important is the biology to meaning and understanding? Is biology essential, or is it just a substrate?
I wouldn't say it's the biology that's the important bit. What I think is it's the interaction that the organism has with the environment, right? I think that's the important bit. And that's what's not there in something like ChatGPT, in the sense that ChatGPT gets all this data, this corpus of words, all the words on the internet in the orders in which they appear. And what it builds up is this massive, incredibly impressive internal web of relations between all those words, right? So the meaning of any word is kind of instantiated by the relations it has with all the other words. So it's like a dictionary that's a self-enclosed world. The dictionary itself only has access to all the other words in the dictionary, but it has no reference to anything in the world, right? It's a self-enclosed set of internal relations. And I think a lot of our knowledge is like that, right? When we learn the attributes of an object, when we learn the properties of something, we learn a category that it belongs to, we understand the causal relations and contingencies and dependencies it has with other things. All of that builds up this kind of internal schema of relations that allows us to understand the world. But we have two other things, right? When we talk about the meaning of some neural pattern, say in the brain, that neural pattern is, for a lot of things like for perception, is about something out in the world, right? So it has a physical correlate with something out in the world, and we use that, right? That's useful for us because it's used for something. So it's about something and it's for something. And even in the simplest organisms, we started talking about bacteria, those signals inside, that's how they start. They're about something in the world and they're for some kind of action. And actually their meaning is not separately apprehended internally. The meaning is just approach or avoid, right? It's a pragmatic consequence. But as you build up the nervous system, you get these separate levels, these separate layers, where the internal representations, they're decoupled from obligate action. They're still about something out in the world. They're still used to inform action, just not in that obligate, directly coupled kind of a way. But now they have these internal relations as well. Now they can be they have some relation to other things that you're storing representations about and building knowledge about. And so when you come to something like ChatGPT, it has all that internal stuff, but it just doesn't have any reference to the world, and it has never had any ability to intervene on the world in a way that would allow it to distinguish causal relations from just correlations.
Going back to like what you were saying about sort of the sort of sensory limitations of like something like ChatGPT, right? Because it's taken whatever exists in language and put this sort of network of relationships together, which is pretty amazing. Lets us configure all kinds of applications relatively quickly. And I'm thinking, okay, let's imagine the future version of ChatGPT, which actually can see the world, which can smell the world, which has tactile things. Maybe it can make love. I don't know. I'm just like, letting my mind sort of run loose and say, okay, it has all this sort of sensory input as well. So it has sensory grounding. Now, has it found meaning the way we do? And does it understand the world the way we do? And I'm not sure what the answer is because, in your view of the world, sort of the neuroscience view of the world, the stuff that's going on inside us is like, things pumping potentials, equilibria, all of this like messy stuff that's going on inside us to maintain order. And all of this stuff is somehow giving life meaning, right? For organisms.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is that living things need meaning, right? They make meaning in a sense, right? They have to make sense of what's out in the world, and they have to use that to solve problems. The main problem is to stay alive. So there's some things that they need to know about. And actually, a lot of the neural details, the syntax of what's happening is not that important. Right? It's the semantics of it that's really important when you get to a certain level of complexity. So in our brains, we have patterns of neural activity, say in the visual system, that may represent the fact that there's a face out in the world, right? So you have different parts of the visual cortex that sort of respond to and encode, if you wish, different types of things that are out in the world, and that basically just report to the rest of the nervous system. These are the objects that are out in the world. Right? And we have to make all kinds of inferences in order to do that, because, of course, our visual system doesn't perceive objects in the world. It just perceives photons of light bouncing off things. And we have to infer what's out in the world and internally represent it. When we do that, the details of those patterns are not the important thing. There's loads of microstates that could correspond to the same macro state. But many of the details are arbitrary and incidental. What matters is what the pattern means within the cognitive economy of the system. And that's, if you can get to that kind of a regime in an artificial system, which I don't see any reason why you can't. It just requires coarse graining and abstracting away from details, and abstracting away the important principles and elements that you're interested in. Then I think you would have a system that's truly semantic. Right? And I think that there probably will be a turn towards that kind of thinking in the architecture of artificial systems that is more focused on the higher order kind of patterns and less on the low level details. And in fact, maybe that's kind of what transformer architectures actually do to a certain extent. They abstract away from some of the details.
Yeah. No, I'm actually just sort of wondering what meaning even means, because I see what it means to us. Like I see what it means to living beings, right? It's these, it's patterns about the world that are sort of encoded in our neural circuits, and it's come about through a very long process of trial and error and survival, like, creating life, to begin with, that sort of has all these capabilities. It sort of reminds me of, a really good quote by Hans Moravec that goes as follows. Encoded in the large, highly evolved sensory and motor portions of the human brain is 1 billion years of experience about the nature of the world and how to survive in it. The deliberate process we call reasoning is the thinnest veneer of human thought, effective only because it is supported by this much older and much more powerful, though usually unconscious, sensory motor knowledge, unquote. It reminds me of this conversation I had with Tony Zador last year, who said that the wiring diagram of the brain, which lets animals learn really rapidly, is far too complex to be specified in the genome. So it goes through something called, he calls, quote unquote, a genomic bottleneck that compresses the instructions necessary for wiring up the complex brain. But now, with the ability to edit life, we could create new species with new wirings. Really interesting.
I mean, what's really interesting is that life is ruthlessly efficient. So when you're thinking about, single-celled organisms and so on, they keep the minimal machinery to keep going, and they're very, very streamlined, genetically speaking. Right? Bacteria will just get rid of genes that they're not using for a while, and hope that somebody else can give it back to them at some future point if they need it. So, and that's true in our cognitive systems as well. We have, like, firing neural action potentials is really energetically expensive, and our brains already use huge amount of our energy. So neural systems are designed to compute and pass information in an extraordinarily efficient way. So they'll only fire spikes when they need to. They transmit the minimum information over long distances. They use the minimum amount of wire to do what they need to do, and they compress the information as much as they can get away with, so that they get the information they need and get rid of the details. And interestingly, I think that compression is the very thing that allows us to abstract principles and to think of categories and properties and things we're not thinking about every little detail of every little bit of information we've ever been exposed to, because we can't. And that's a good thing, because we then have this pressure to keep just the information that we need that's meaningful. And in that sense, I think meaning has two uses, or two meanings. I did it. Where the first is that it's information that's about something, right? And the second is that it's salient information. It's relevant to the survival of the organism. And that's the information that we operate on cognitively, right? We're not operating on photons hitting our photoreceptors. We're not thinking about that. We're thinking about the objects whose existence we have inferred through all these processes of the neural hierarchy.
So on that, Kevin, do you think AI and machines can actually alter our wiring? That they might actually change our cortex and how our brains are configured? Or is that something that happens over a much longer time span?
Yes, it does happen over a much longer time span, evolutionarily speaking, but it also happens over our individual lifetimes, because reconfiguring the microcircuitry of our brains is what learning is, right? That's how learning is achieved. And so, one of the really, really interesting things that I wish I kind of had the room to talk about it in the book is that this, I talk about biological evolution that gets us to the capacities we have for cognition and metacognition, reasoning about our own reasons and so on. What I don't talk about much is cultural evolution, the next stage of that has allowed us, because we can share knowledge, because we have language, because we have this cumulative culture that no other animal has. We have had this incredible expansion of our capacities and our causal control over the environment and over ourselves over longer periods of time. And what's really interesting there, I think, is that we've reconfigured each other's brains, the kinds of things that we think about, right? I mean, I think young people these days can think some thoughts with ease that were literally unthinkable 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or whatever. They just couldn't. No one in the world had yet thought of whatever it is, and no one could think of it until somebody did. But once somebody thinks of it, then the idea can just spread like wildfire. And so we can learn all sorts of things, right? We can build up our complicated views of mathematics and physics and biology and languages and everything else in ways that literally are instantiated in the circuitry of our brains, but that also alter our cognitive ways of operating. And I think our interactions with technology can do that as well. In fact, it's very clear that they do. The way that we operate with our mobile phones, for example, that's a cognitive extension in a sense. It changes the way we interact with the world. And so I think that our relationship with AI can alter the way we think and operate. It's not a wholesale rewiring of our brains. But it's a configurational sort of thing that I think can have profound influences on the way we actually behave in the world.
Well, Kevin, this has been a fascinating conversation. So thanks so much for it. When I approached you, I did so with some degree of trepidation that this is such a huge,
Yeah.
subject and, sort of way beyond my pay grade. But I really enjoyed reading your book, and and I actually have an opinion now.
Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And, it's great to get sort of questions from different perspectives that highlight some things, and inevitably they make me wish I had said something a little differently or included something else. But it's really fun to have these conversations. So thanks very much.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I've been in AI for a long time, and I sort of got into it from the standpoint of decision making, thanks to Herb Simon. But I've really sort of gotten, much more deeply into kind of the neuroscience of things, which is providing all kinds of really interesting insights into the nature of intelligence. So, and your book was along those lines. So thanks again for the conversation. Really enjoyed it, Kevin.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.